Access a new endpoint from your own service. So basically you have a microservice you're designing in Spring Boot and you're trying to access a different endpoint, and you have a URL such as this one here, and you want a code to get it. This is the process that I was able to implement, and it took me a while, so I thought I'd make a video. As you can see, I'm using Spring Boot. Maybe a little bit of configuration is important for me to share. So in build Gradle, what is important is to know what release you're using, because anything lower might not work. Some of them, I remember with older projects of Spring Boot versions, I couldn't implement this way. So you'll have to go with the HTTP REST implementation with the client. If you want to use this one I found much more easier, and it's more relevant with the new Spring Boot version. It allows us to code. So these are the dependencies that need to be imported and build Gradle. This one, Spring Cloud Starter Openfeign. And I put this, but if you have a different version, you should find one that's relevant to you. Spring Cloud dependencies. I found Hoxton release, and this is basically what. So I had tried a few different ones, and it didn't work until I discovered that these three worked for this specific version for me. So for me, this is the version 2.2.2 release, and these are the specific ones that worked for me. Okay. So for you, it might be different. A little bit more information. I am using MongoDB to extract this information that I'm getting from a URL. You might be wanting to use MySQL or Postgres. Anything is fine. The Spring Data JPA would do that for you. So that portion is irrelevant. So going back to my client. So once you have this imported, you would be able to implement the way I'm going to show you next. So first thing first, we need to make the actual client that will hit the new URL. So for me, this is the URL I'm trying to hit from my code. It doesn't have a key. If you have a key that is required, then you would need to write the code for that. Not here. I'll show you later where that information will go. So you would have to have an environment variable and probably set it up in your application YAML file. And then from there you will go. But right, for me, I don't have that. So let's look at this URL and what it gives us to get an idea. So here, this is the URL, exactly what my code is going to call. And as you can see, there's no header, there's no body. Oh, this is something I was just working on. But yeah, this could be completely empty. And you basically call this endpoint. So I'm clicking send, and I get this. Okay. So now this is how you get the JSON. There's different ways of implementing. You can simply write the code so that everything is just extracted like in a map style, and you don't care what's coming. For me, I went ahead and implemented the actual class based on this, the object that is coming back. But let's say in the future, like a few items change, then your code will need to change. So if you don't want to do that, there's different implementation that is not in the scope of this video. I will maybe make that later. But for the scope of this video, let's say you have specifically, this is what you're getting, and this is exactly what you want to save. So you will go ahead and make classes for that. But anyways, for now, this is what you need to know. The URL that you're going to call, what you're going to get. And so going back to my code, here I have this annotation fiend client. I gave the name. This has to be something similar as this. It doesn't need to be, but I think it's better and more explicit. The URL I've put here. Now I put like the rest of it here because later on I might want to change it. I might want to get this information from my own endpoint that my application calls, and take this from the user, this number, because this is a bunch of chapters from the Quran. So let's say for now I'm hard coding it just to show for this example, but let's say you didn't want to hard code it, then you would actually take it as a parameter here, and then you would call it, you will make this URL on the fly, getting that input from the user. So now this is just the format I have. So we have a request mapping, the rest of the value. This is not relevant. And this is a get call. So I have explicitly mentioned in the method, it is a request dot method get, and it produces an application JSON. And now here's where you need to do a little bit more work. So this could be anything you want, but this object, it has to match what you're getting here. So as you see, code, status, data. So I went ahead and I created this code, status, data. And now if you notice here, I put the data, no args constructor, all args constructor. This is just a normal class. and these values match. So this is an int, this is a string, it could be an enum if you want it, and this is the data. And you know what, later on you might want to even like right now I'm just doing for the sake of like a simple whatever, but in the future maybe you don't want to go ahead and extract the data if the status came wrong. So you would implement that somewhere probably in your code right here, that if it's not valid, then throw an error right here, don't even go ahead to process the data. So that's something you can implement later. But going back to the object, so here now notice I have addition data, because this data object that I'm getting, it's actually a list. If you can look in here, and even I have to work in the past with Google APIs and stuff, and so you have to really kind of, it gets very tedious how to look at what the object is coming. So here we see this is a list of items. So I just made it like this is a data, I made it data, and these names have to match actually, because it reads into it exactly. So see how this is code status data, if that's, this part does need to match, however the class name doesn't need to match. So these could be anything you choose it to be, or rather, yeah, the type of object, it doesn't need to match, but the names have to match, because that's what you're storing it in when you get that call. So here I created a new class or object, addition data, and that would reflect the rest of the fields accordingly. So if I go into this object, you'll see now here, this is the annotation that does matter, JSON property. And now again, this number, name, these are all matching from here. If you can see name, from here, number, name, English translation. And this is like, this is the format how I have it set, because in my Mongo, I don't want to save it as this. I actually do want to go ahead and save it like that. So you can do however you want, but this is how I have it implemented. So yeah, so these are all the fields that are coming in this object, if you notice. So number, name, English name, and within Aya, again, I have this a new object for Aya. I took a sample here, you don't need this, but basically I converted this also into an object, and then this is where it ends. So now this is how you implement your object. So going back to our client now, this is now my client should get this response, right? So this is the response that my client should get. Now this method needs to be called from my service that I have implemented. So this is my QE service, which is my Quran edition service. And now here I'm again auto-wiring a QE client, and I'm calling that, see, this is the client being called to get QE data. So this is the same method that we implemented here. This should really be QE, but anyways. So this is getting called here. And actually this is where the key would have gone. If you had a key that, let's say you had a key, this is free right now, but let's say it was a paid URL like Google Maps or some other company's URL, then you would actually go ahead and you would put that in your environment variables, because you don't want it to be in your code. And then you would mention that, like, when you call this, you will have to pass it as part of the parameter to that function. So you would pass it here probably, and then it will get called over here as part of the header, or the however you want to implement it or is required. So here we don't have a key, so I didn't need to. I just straightforward call the method. I get the response. This is my response. It's the QE info class model that we created ourselves. We're just sending it back now. So where are we sending this back to? It's gonna go into my my service class. So this is my service class, QE information, info editions, and get data. And now here's my object. Now I made this model in Mongo. So QE data is a model that reflects to a collection I created in Mongo. So I can show you how it looks. This is my Mongo. It's just an interface to show it nicely. But this is the collection. Kitab, and if you notice here, I already took one out. One object is already gotten saved. So before you run this something like this, you do have to create the collection. It should be empty, but it needs to be created. So if I go ahead and do a select all and run and show you, here we have one object already, and if you notice, it creates its own ID, but this is actually what we had created, the addition, and it's array of 1, and you can actually see the whole object here. So it's stored for the whole one surah in the model that we wanted. Now going back here, so this is my collection. This is what it's being the document is being set up over here with this label. So yeah, that was in Mongo edition. I could have enabled it something else. But anyway, so yeah, so this is here. Going back to my method. Here, we were over here. So we call QE client through this QE service. And now I'm setting my QE object with that set edition because that was my field in the Mongo. So I got that object from the client and now I'm setting it here and then I'm returning it to the QE repository to be saved. This is what's happening in Mongo. And then this method gets called from the actual controller, which is this endpoint right here. So now I'll just show you from, I guess I'll show you in debug mode, like how it's happening so that you see the other, end of the cycle rather than going backwards because this was sort of backward. So again, this is my call here. It runs fine. I'm calling the same call from my method. So this is my method. So this is the previous call. As you can see, this was for 114 that I had hard coded, but you could technically pass it as part of your header and code for it like I suggested in the method itself. So now if I send this, did it not go? What?